All right, so let me introduce myself first briefly. So I am Michael Reynolds. This is my first semester as a graduate student with Dr. Powell, but I was one of the first members of the IAC when it was started in 2016. I did 4 semesters with the IAC during my undergraduate, and then upon graduating, I went to work for Nexant, which is an engineering consulting company. They do work with Rocky Mountain Power and are very much in the principal role of the implementer of the energy efficiency programs for Dominion Energy. And so Nexant is to Dominion what Cascade is to Rocky Mountain Power, or what KW is to certain sectors of Rocky Mountain Power's customers. And beyond implementing the energy efficiency programs for Dominion, Nexant also helps with regulatory framework for the energy efficiency program, with all sorts of engineering and tech analysis for other utilities nationwide. And it was a fun place to work for. I really enjoyed my time there. I actually got into that role networking through Dr. Powell, so that goes to show the power of networking. But during my time at Nexant, I got to be kind of very knowledgeable in this field of natural gas energy. We worked on a lot of natural gas projects, and so that's kind of what I'll be sharing with you all today. So let's start talking about natural gas just in general. It's primarily methane. There are small amounts of ethane, other alkanes, and then there's a gas called mercaptan that is added as an odorizer. Otherwise, gas would be very difficult to detect if it was leaking, so they add something to alert people if there is a leak. Natural gas is typically sold by energy content. It's typically sold by the decatherm. A decatherm is 10 therms. A decatherm is also 100,000 BTU of energy. So when you see a natural gas bill that's in units of decatherms, that is an energy content, not a volumetric flow rate. But you can convert energy content to volume using the specific heat content. So this is shown here is the specific heat content for Utah, which is I've taken from the Energy Information Administration. They have kind of a compendium of sources for all states year by year. And this is an average for pipeline quality natural gas delivered in the state, 1,046 BTU per foot cubed. So that's something you can back calculate just from the natural gas bill that you're seeing. Gas is typically used for electric power generation. More of that has come online to replace coal. Then once it's delivered to the end user, it's used for comfort heating, for process heating, hot water heating, domestic hot water, and then cooking in certain, at your home and in certain institutional locations. Cooking can be a major component. It's one of the cleanest burning sources of emissions in terms of fossil fuel. I mean, it is a fossil fuel, it is limited. It does produce CO2, just not as much as coal or other heavier gases or gasoline. And at least in the current market, is a lower cost per energy unit delivered. Natural gas production in the United States has gone up recently. What I would cautiously say is that combustion is always more cost effective than electric resistive heating. And there is an ongoing technical series of advances that may make it competitive with heat pumps in terms of the price that you pay for the energy used for your heating. And for domestic HVAC use. For commercial and industrial use, there are certain applications where electric is preferred, but for a lot of process heating, there simply is no competition with natural gas. So part of the reason for this state of affairs is the transmission process. When natural gas is extracted from wherever it is, it goes through a relatively minor process of refining and transportation through pipelines, and then is delivered directly to a customer or to a home as a primary energy source. And that's why we avoid the the generation losses and the distribution losses that we see from an electric grid. Now, this depends very much on the state of the grid. It depends on the energy balance of the grid, the fraction of renewable, the efficiency of the transmission distribution network. But a lot of times the energy that you're using at your home, and the electric energy you're using at home or at your business, really represents between 27 and 38% of the original energy used to produce that. I mean, if you think about using electric resistance for heating, what you're basically saying is that you've taken natural gas, you've burned it, you've converted it to electricity, and then you've converted it back into heat. And you can see that at every step, you are having inefficiencies and losses. And so that is something to keep in mind. A lot of times when we talk about site energy versus source energy, it's easy to say that a building is efficient or that something is superior because it uses less electricity on a site basis. But if you trace it back to its origin and apply a source correction factor, we end up with a less rosy picture of electrification. So how do commercial and industrial customers use natural gas? Well, this is from a document that Nexant did for a natural gas utility in Connecticut, Eversource. You can see that for all of these segments, heating, the comfort heating of the facility of the building is one of the primary uses, even in a manufacturing or industrial type of facility. Now, I also want to point out that process heating does consume a significant portion of the natural gas load in manufacturing and in research laboratories. But a lot of these other places that I think the IAC will mostly be focused on manufacturing, maybe some research laboratories, and maybe some agriculture. So we really do see quite a bit of process heating. If we ever dip into a hospital or to an educational or other public institution, we won't see very much process heating. We'll be dealing a lot with comfort heating, and those can be complex systems all on their own between the HVAC, the ventilation air. And then one other interesting thing to point out is hospitals have a much higher proportion of hot water than you would expect, that you might expect to see. That goes directly into their laundry supplies and their sterilization procedures. And then in terms of others and cooking we don't see a lot of in any of these sectors. We do see a lot of other in this utility sector. I can't exactly tell you what that is, but these are the main areas that gas is used in various sectors, and that's what we'll be kind of focused on at the IAC, and in addition in other energy efficiency sectors. This is basically how gas tends to be used. So then the question is, what types of things can we do for gas efficiency? So I've listed a list of 9 both by commonality of the measure and the quantity of savings. And I'll give you a second to look through those. And then I'll pull out some comment. I'll pull out some of my questions, but I want to see if any of you have questions or comments based on this list of measures on, in your own experience, what do you see as measures we've used commonly, or anything strikes you? So go ahead and comment here if you'd like.
Michael, do you mind if I ask you a question, actually?
Yeah.
So, I don't want to take too much time, but I've always wondered the difference between a condensing boiler and a conventional boiler. I hear that condensers are more energy efficient. If you could just briefly maybe explain why.
That's actually on the very next slide. So that's something I've pointed out that I want to talk to everybody about as well.
Cool.
I had a quick question, and this is just kind of random, but so you mentioned that the reason natural gas was more efficient was that it's the primary source, or energy source. Um, it, if electricity was generated through, like, we're going to say entirely wind, would it be more efficient than gas?
So there's a difference between efficiency and carbon neutrality. So a fully renewable grid with 100% wind or solar is not going to generate any carbon. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be efficient, in the sense that there will still be losses in the transmission of that energy from where it's generated to where it's used. You may not still have the application of it. Cutting out the step where you go through a combustion to generate that electricity will remove a lot of the inefficiency. It'll remove that 65 to 40% loss of the primary energy in that conversion process. So the answer is yes, with the understanding that it will be completely carbon neutral, not necessarily completely efficient, but much more efficient if you cut out that combustion intermediary step.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions up to now?
Can you remind me what an ERV is?
Yeah, so an ERV is an energy recovery ventilator, and we'll talk about that on the next slide too. Also, you could call it an air-to-air heat exchanger. So my takeaways from this that I wanted to share with you are, what does it mean to be condensing? I also want to talk about some of the efficiency metrics or rubrics that are used in terms of what do they really mean? And then talk about what infrared and radiant heaters are, how they are different from forced air or hydronic systems. So let's talk about some of the technologies that we'll see. So the first one, as Conrad brought up just a little while ago, is what does it mean to have a condensing or a non-condensing furnace or boiler or water heater? So the most basic form is a non-condensing furnace or water heater. That basically means that you are not able to recover any of the latent heat of the water vapor produced in the combustion process. So a non-condensing furnace will burn the natural gas, and then everything that goes out the flue, both the combustion byproducts going out the flue and being lost, will include water vapor in its gaseous form. A condensing boiler or a condensing furnace will have a secondary heat exchanger that will condense the water out of that flue gas. And by doing that, you'll recover a much larger portion of the heat in that combustion process. Now, this means that you will have to deal with liquid condensate, water that can be slightly caustic, or, it's not pure water coming out of that, dripping off of that secondary heat exchanger. So there are some considerations, and that has led to some barriers for more widespread adaptation of condensing boilers, furnaces, and the like. But basically, your upper limit of efficiency for a non-condensing furnace or boiler is about 80 to 82%. Once you get into that condensing technology, you can get upwards of 95 to 97.5%. So you really are seeing about a 15 to 18% improvement if you can go to a condensing heat exchanger, although there are some additional installation and maintenance factors to consider with that second heat exchanger. They're usually made out of stainless steel. They're a little bit more expensive, but that is something that is pushed very heavily throughout natural gas utilities across the country. Conversely, an infrared or a radiant heating system versus a forced air or a hydronic system, hydronic referring to using water to deliver heat. Infrared systems like the one on the left don't try to heat the air and then heat people and things by delivering that air through a vent and a fan. Infrared heating systems will apply that directly to the surface without heating an intermediary layer. So a lot of times these are used in large facilities, large as in they have high ceilings and big doors. A lot of times you'll see them in transportation infrastructure, so garages, hangars, a lot of intermodal nodes, distribution centers. We also see them sometimes they're required by code anytime you're trying to heat an outdoor space. So like on garage or like restaurant patios, things like that, they'll be required. And they don't follow the same efficiency as a forced air or a hydronic system because they're really not heating anything they deliver heat directly to the recipient. They don't heat an intermediary layer. So they can be very useful in terms of delivering it directly to areas where people are working instead of heating a large volume of air and delivering that to the occupants. When we talk about HVAC measures, indirect fired and direct fired is also something to talk about. Indirect fired, again, means that the flame doesn't go directly into the space. Direct fired means that the flame is basically in the supply duct and it's delivered directly to the location. So indirect fired is almost standard for HVAC. There will be a heat exchanger. The combustion gases are all contained inside the heat exchanger, and then a second stream of air passes over that heat exchanger, and that air is what's delivered to the space. Direct fired heaters result in some combustion byproducts getting into the space, and that can be acceptable for kitchens, hangars, garages, and sometimes it's not acceptable where there's a higher concentration of people. Also wanted to talk about metrics. AFUE is annual fuel utilization efficiency. It's the metric for furnaces, and it takes into account the partial efficiency at various stages of the year. Thermal efficiency is for boilers. It's a similar, it doesn't take into account the time weighting average of furnaces. The Energy Star certification is something slightly different. Energy Star is the US Department of Energy label that says things are more efficient than comparison products. So anything that's labeled with an Energy Star label has been shown to be kind of on the upper edge of efficiency. Combustion tune-ups and excess O2 control, O2 trim control are things you can do to make a boiler burn more efficiently. You're not going to get an incredible improvement in this kind of simply doing a combustion tune-up isn't going to get you 10 or 15% improvement. Realistically, it might get you 4 to 5% improvement. Well, optimistically 4 to 5% improvement. Realistically, maybe 2 to 3% improvement in terms of gas efficiency. So those are something that can be harder to push or harder to quantify. And then the waste heat recovery that we talk about with ERVs, energy recovery ventilators, these can also be done with runaround loops or coils. Anywhere that you have heat and you have a useful application for it somewhere else can be a candidate for waste heat recovery. And then it just becomes a question of how difficult is it to move heat from one place to another. And I think the IAC has quite a bit of experience looking at waste heat recovery. But if we go back to the slide a couple ago and talk about those custom applications, which are the largest in terms of quantity of savings, a lot of those custom projects either arise from or are basically waste heat recovery in some form or another.
Michael, I'm curious, in your time with doing Dominion incentives and custom rebates, did you have an example of water-to-water heat exchange that was incentivized?
Let's see, water-to-water heat exchanger.
Some type of water was being discharged, heated water was being discharged and ultimately used to preheat some kind of incoming water
I have seen water-to-water heat exchange used actually for cooling for a greenhouse. I haven't seen hot process water used to preheat something coming in as a custom incentive, but that is a good practice. And it is something that could be incentivized if they're on the right rate schedule, which we'll get to. Any other comments or questions about some of these topics we've gone into?
Michael, I have a question about the gas infrared heater.
Yeah.
So does humidity have an impact on the efficiency of on its efficiency?
No, a gas infrared heater won't have much to do with humidity. The heat is actually being transferred as infrared radiation, so it will mostly pass through the water vapor in the air. So humidity isn't something we deal with a whole lot here in Utah, since we have a very arid climate. We're in an ASHRAE climate zone that shows that we are not worried very much about humidity, but this is something that will kind of bypass the humidity in the air anyway.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, because not specifically for Utah, but in other places where you might find 90% humidity. Like where I'm living right now in Peru, there's like 85% of humidity or 90% of humidity. So I was like thinking about something like that. But yeah, thank you. Makes
And
sense.
usually when we're talking about heating, humidity isn't as much of a problem, because adding heat to an air system will actually reduce the relative humidity. You're not adding water to the air, but you are expanding the capacity of the air to retain water by raising it to a higher temperature. So usually we deal with humidity more when we're going through a cooling sequence, because we have to remove humidity in the air. As we cool the air becomes less able to hold water, and therefore we have to remove water from the air while we're doing comfort cooling.
Michael, one other question I had, if you could go back to the previous slide where you had your list. Again, this is just of interest to me because of your experience with in the last 2 years with rebate programs. Of the ones that you see listed here, do you have working current knowledge of costing associated with any of these? So like a rule of thumb for condensing boilers these days on a $1 per, BTU size basis or something?
I do have knowledge of the deemed incremental costs of condensing most of these types of equipment. So that isn't to say the cost of a whole new condensing boiler.
Yeah.
It is to say the cost of selecting a high efficiency condensing boiler versus a non-condensing boiler, the extra cost to do that. So mostly those are deemed costs. In terms of
Is that deemed incremental cost?
Yeah, a deemed incremental cost.
Good to know. What about radiant heaters? Do you have a similar working knowledge at this point of current pricing for those applications?
Yes, I do.
Also a deemed cost?
Also a deemed incremental cost.
Okay, great. We will tap into that.
Any other questions about these efficiency measures before we get to combined heat and power, which I know is something everyone is very on top of? All right, let's talk about combined heat and power. So combined heat and power goes beyond simply being an energy efficiency measure. It is something that has ancillary benefits in reliability, in dispatchability, from reduced risk of energy sources. It is something very complex. It is something very capital intensive. It is something that, in a sense, waits for the right moment, the right opportunity. That is why it can be very difficult to push, why companies can be reluctant to implement it, but it does have such an array of benefits that there are applications very well suited for it. So combined heat and power is just a way of saying that we are going to basically have a generating unit, and then we're going to recover all of the heat from that generating unit and put it to use somewhere in our facility. So CHP is broken down by the type of technology used in the prime mover. So we have reciprocating engines, we have gas turbines, we have micro turbines, we have hydrogen fuel cells, we have steam turbines. These are all based on Department of Energy information available on their extension manufacturing partnership. Don't know exactly what it is, but the overall benefit to combined heat and power is right there in the red highlight. It is the combined efficiency of the gas and the electric generation in one package. As you kind of see in this graphic, if combined heat and power is basically doing the work of an on-site boiler and displacing grid-supplied electric energy. And it's doing those together at a much more efficient rate than would be possible otherwise. It's also providing a facility the ability to keep going in the event of power failure, in the event of changing energy prices. They're kind of protected from those for the most part. There's a lot of information here on the left, and I don't want to go too far into this because I think that's something that would need its own presentation probably. But suffice it to say that combined heat and power can be very effective if you are sizing it for the existing thermal load and you've already gone through other efficiency measures to make sure it's not oversized. There's very little benefit to installing a combined heat and power system that is too large for the application. You really want to size it based on the thermal load and then use the electric you generate kind of as a side benefit, not as, you want to approach it with the heat as the primary motivating use and then the electric as the complementary benefit rather than vice versa. And there are numerous resources to help calculate energy savings using metrics such as fuel chargeable to power and the fleet weighted average heat rate, which can help you convert between electric and the electricity delivered and the gas used to generate that electricity. I have some information about that. I actually put together a pretty technical method of doing the energy savings analysis for this with Dominion's CHP incentive program, which is very limited and probably not something that most of our customers will be eligible for. So then I know, oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry, Michael, just to add to that, so the tool that you have sounds awesome. I think that's really cool that we'll have that now. On the last assessment for AutoLive, we considered CHP, and if you reach out to CHP TAP, that's CHP Technical Assistance Partnership, they'd be happy to help you with the analysis. Just make sure that you do it through Julie and that you do it very early on. They take a little bit of time to get around to it, but they do a great analysis. So just so you guys know, that's a good resource.
There are lots of federal partnerships to promote CHP. It's just proving harder to get people to bite on than we would have liked. So what are GS, FS, and TS rate schedules from Dominion? I know that's something you're all probably wanting to know. General service and fixed service are alike. Transportation service is different. GS and FS customers both buy the natural gas from Dominion directly. GS customers are kind of a smaller group in terms of overall use. They have a cap on how much they use during the winter season. GS customers tend to be all residential, many small, almost all small to medium businesses, a lot of elementary schools. GS customers do pay a demand side management charge and can receive incentives. GS customers can receive incentives. Unfortunately, these other two classes do not pay that charge, and they cannot receive incentives. So the first question for gas incentives is always whether they're a GS customer. And if yes, the answer is absolutely. If they are not, the answer is unfortunately no. So fixed service customers are similar to GS customers in that they buy the gas from Dominion. They differ from GS customers in that they have a large annual, they have a very large base load of gas. That is to say that even during the summer, they're using a substantial fraction of their peak winter day gas usage. So we see this most frequently in natatoriums, greenhouses, some medium to large real estate, some small manufacturing. If they're not aware they can get a better rate through TS, will be on this rate schedule. They can't receive incentives. So transportation service is, these customers do not buy gas from Dominion. They buy gas directly from the wholesale market and enter into an agreement with Dominion to deliver that gas to their site via Dominion's pipelines. So they pay an administrative fee each year, but then a much lower rate for their gas from Dominion, as well as a per unit charge from their whoever they're buying the gas from. These customers tend to be large institutions, high schools, colleges, hospitals, very large commercial buildings. All of the high-tech area in Lehigh does TS rate schedule. It's also basically the standard throughout industrial and manufacturing if they're of any size. And then one other thing to comment on is interruptible versus uninterruptible. This is kind of like an asterisk at the end of the rate for TS customers to say whether Dominion can shut off their supply in the event of a major shortcoming in the grid network. During a peak winter day, for example, certain customers will receive, a customer can say, we can't have our gas shut off for any reason, and they will pay a little bit extra, and Dominion will guarantee that they won't be shut off. If a customer is flexible enough to say, yeah, we can afford to be curtailed at certain points in the year as long as it's not for too long, Dominion will give them a bit of a break on their rate. So that can be something else you see on a gas bill. So what is the break even for natural gas? These rates are pulled directly from Dominion's tariff. On the left is GS, on the right is transportation firm. Unfortunately, I have a bit of a mistake on here. But basically, what you see on the left is that both customers will pay a basic monthly charge. And I hope you just see the red marker that I just put on. So that BSF category is just for the meter. It depends on the size classification of the meter. That's the only really fixed charge that a GS customer will pay per month or per year. A transportation rate will pay this administrative charge of $3,000. And that is kind of the deciding factor if, they have a larger base fixed cost per year. And then you see they have a very different DTH, cost per DTH. And I picked the one for all over 45 for GS and for the next 112,500 decatherms for, so right here and right there. Now, unfortunately, the mistake I have made in this equation down at the bottom is when does the left equal the right? Unfortunately, on the right, you also have to add the cost per decatherm that they are paying to the supplier of the natural gas. So in reality, they will be paying $3,000 plus 0.4140 for X, which is the amount of gas. They will also be paying, I don't know, let's say $3.50X, and that will go to the supplier. Now, this does tend to make a lot of sense for most large customers. It really can't be beat when you're using, depending on the quantity of natural gas you're using. But that X right there really is what makes or breaks the difference between whether this makes sense or whether it doesn't. So any questions about this in the previous slide? I know that a lot of you are, this is something that comes up a lot. I've gotten questions about this. So what do you guys think?
So you said that TS is the transport service, but then there's a difference between the GS and what was the other one that was not transport gas?
Fixed
FS.
service, FS.
Okay. So most of the manufacturing plants that we're looking at, since they're medium size or small size manufacturers, they'll be on GS, but we have to double check.
I think a lot of the sites we find are on transportation service.
Okay.
You know, it's hard to guarantee what a customer is going to be on until you see their bill. And it's something it should be one of the first things you look for on a customer's natural gas bill, especially from Dominion. If they buy their gas from Dominion, is it will say it on the bill very prominently. GS, FS, or TS. And if you
agree, by the way, that the majority of the gas users that come across the IAC at this point tend to fall in that TS rate.
And if you see a gas bill that says TS from Dominion, you should automatically look for the rest of the story from whoever they buy the gas from. Don't ever look at a gas bill from Dominion, look at TS and say, oh wow, they only pay 41 cents per decatherm for their gas. They're paying for the gas to someone else, and there's a second set of bills that you need to look for.
Question, Michael.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
So lots of the time we actually see discrepancies between who they're buying the gas from and the gas that's being put through the Dominion meter. So like they'll be off by, I don't know, a couple hundred decatherms or something, which isn't always a lot, but does affect the rates that we use. Do you know, I mean, in your experience, would you rather use the flow rate from the people they're buying from or the flow rate from the Dominion meter?
I would recommend using the flow rate from the Dominion meter because that is the meter at the entry point between the pipeline and the customer. That meter is going to be the most accurate. The type of arrangement that results in a transportation service, the customer says to the wholesaler, we will buy this much gas from you for this long at this rate. Then they make this agreement with Dominion for that contracted rate, but they don't necessarily always use that amount of gas every month. And there's something very much, there's a part of the transportation rate service agreement that is a daily or a weekly imbalance difference charge. So there is a legal, or there's a way to recompense that in terms of the relationship between Dominion and the customer. But for our purposes, what goes through the meter is what's actually being used in the facility. What the customer has agreed to buy from the wholesaler doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's being used day to day in their facility.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go through the last 2 or 3, and then we'll take some more questions. I know I'm running short on time. So the Dominion program is called Thermwise. Go to thermwise.com and you will be able to see what they offer both for businesses and for people who are individual homeowners, contractors who are building homes, and for multifamily programs as well. The prescriptive rebates program is Dominion's pride and joy. I have probably can't see it very directly there, but they have a list of rebates where if you qualify, you get this much as a rebate based on the size of your equipment. They also have a custom program, which is basically $1 per therm of savings, up to 50% of project cost. It has to be pre-approved and go through a technical review from Nexant. It's You can't do a custom rebate for something that could be offered through the prescriptive program. If you have questions about what would qualify for prescriptive versus not, I'm a pretty good resource to talk to about that, or just about rebate qualifications in general.
Michael, you might just briefly clarify your language around prescriptive versus custom for everybody so they know what the difference is.
Yeah, prescriptive basically means that if it meets certain requirements, you use a very simple, you just send in an application for it, basically. You say, I bought this, I installed it this date, here's the invoice, and Dominion sends a check. There's really nothing more complex than providing proof of payment and proof of install and proof that it meets the requirements. A custom program is when you have to say, well, we don't meet these requirements or we don't fit into these categories. We have to show some calculations and get a different rate for it. So I really wish I had the time to tell you more about what these actual efficiency metrics are. And I wish you could see these PDFs better, but I will put this PDF inside the box somewhere so that you can go and look at it later and see more of what this list right here is. All the prescriptive rebates, and these are available at the thermwise.com/business rebates. It's the PDF, the quick reference guide. And then the custom projects are what we will probably end up doing more of if we have opportunities. These programs are mostly designed for residential and commercial HVAC. So a lot of what we might find won't fit into that, or could fit into that, but would be better to take through the custom program. Dominion also has an analyst incentive. So instead of paying engineering firms like Rocky Mountain Power does, as they do for Cascade and KW, Dominion will send an additional incentive directly to the analyst who prepares and directs the custom gas efficiency project. So the customer gets the full rebate, but then the analyst gets an additional rebate directly to them based on a tiered rate structure and based on successful completion and installation and verification of the project. This is something that individuals, firms, or third-party energy consulting companies can take advantage of. You simply have to follow all the steps in the custom program, do the required measurement and verification, do the required commissioning, and then submit the reports to Thermwise and respond to any technical review procedure that Nexant wants you to go through. This is something that the IAC as a whole could prepare and benefit from. I don't want to encourage individual members of the IAC to try to do this unless Cody and Julie clear it from an ethical and attribution correction standpoint. But Dominion does offer this to almost anybody who has the technical knowledge to successfully prepare and direct this project and respond to the technical review process from Nexant. So this is just kind of a final throwaway slide for renewable natural gas. It's something we might talk about a lot, something that Dominion is trying to put a green face on. It's basically making natural gas, collecting natural sources of methane from landfills or agriculture or wastewater treatment, collecting the methane, purifying it, and then re-injecting it into the distribution line and use it just as normal gas. So it should be identical to natural gas. They have to refine it to pipeline quality, but then it's basically gas that you can also feel good about because you pay extra for it and it comes from a cow's butt. And with that, I will turn it over for final questions.
So quick question on,
Be careful with your questions, because how better can you end a class than on the note of a cow's butt?
Just make sure that any questions end with that. Or answer.
Michael, I was going to ask, so you said GS customers were the only ones getting incentives. Does that apply also for rebates?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Michael, something that Julie and I were talking a little bit about is potentially creating a tool that compares TS rates to GS rates to see which one a customer should use, if there's a savings there. Do you think that's a tool that we could pursue, or do you think it's a little difficult doing that since it's on such a case-by-case basis?
I think that would be a useful tool, and I don't think it would be that difficult. I think that would be a good thing for a class project if that's where you're thinking of taking it. Where I would recommend you go, I don't know if you can still see my screen if you see the Dominion Energy Utah tariff, but this will tell the Dominion Energy Utah tariff is where I took these rates from, and it has all of the information about each rate class. So I think that if you want to go and research that a little bit more, that would be a very useful tool and not something overly difficult to do by any means.
Cool, thank you.
Michael, so on one of your slides, one of the main, I think it was the #1 spot for projects that you take on is custom heating. Mm-hmm. Usually, what does that entail?
A lot of what will fall in here is waste heat recovery. And beyond that, like, it's basically anything that's not any of these others. Maybe it's the unique application of a boiler to preheat feed water, or you're some type of preheating, or it's some type of recovery of you're using the incoming boiler feed water to also produce domestic hot water or something. The custom category is just so hard to define because it's basically everything that's not any of these others. And that's why it fits under so many things, and it's a surprisingly important part of a commercial and industrial gas program. You just have to have that large bucket of everything that's not X is Y.
Okay, gotcha.
Michael, it sounds like we've gotten to the bottom of the questions.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Happy to do it.
It's really cool to have someone bring their prior experience with a energy consulting company to help better inform the IAC. I would say on the issue of students, taking on outside work, like in that analyst role, I don't think we're going to be able to do something like that. But when you guys graduate, that's a great potentially career. You could be employed by a consulting firm or start your own consulting firm. But I don't think as IAC members, we should be doing something like that.
It is something that could be paid to the IAC directly, kind of as an entity.
I don't think DOE would let us do that either.
Come on, Dr. Powell, you don't want a new couch in the workspace?
I have been saving up for a new couch in the workspace for years, but we're almost there.
Okay, well, we will see you all next week. Have a good week.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep, no problem.